Hello, my name is Britt Santos, and welcome to another episode of the Lifesprings International podcast. Lifesprings is a global network whose mission is to connect, encourage, and prepare women worldwide to impact their communities with the love of Jesus. We believe faith formation and carrying out the work of being Jesus' hands and feet should be done in community. Not just that, but I know for me personally, my understanding of the Trinity and God existing in eternal relationship furthers my conviction that as human beings, we were created to be in relationships and we flourish in healthy communities. But as I'm sure all our listeners know, doing things with others can come with understandable challenges. So, never mind international ministry, anyone who's ever done a group project knows what I'm talking about. So, how do we do it? Well, the short answer is Jesus. And the long answer is something that we have been exploring for the past 6 episodes, which is that we have an intentional rhythm of prayer to prepare us to minister together, listen, and make hard decisions, and grow in our Christ likeness, not just as individuals, but as a community. After all, we are collectively called to be the body of Christ. As a quick recap, so far, our prayers of preparation have covered being faithful stewards, the prayer of indifference, for wisdom, to be peace bringers, and for humility. That brings us to today and our last prayer of preparation, which is the prayer for quiet trust. With Christa and I today is Janice Gutierrez, author and retired pastor and former Lifesprings executive director. Janice is an incredible resource, particularly on the topic of writing out your rule of life, something we will have to bring her back on the podcast to talk about. And yes, that's a little hint as to what our next series is. But for today, Janice is going to help us understand this prayer for quiet trust and why it is so foundational to our life and ministries. Here's our interview with Janice. Hello, everyone. I'm here in person with my friend Christa. Came out to the beautiful community of Wetaskiwin because not only are we recording a podcast today, but we are gathering with some of our other Lifespring friends to do a prayer walk, and we're really excited about that. But before we do that, I got to meet you, I guess, was it a year and a half ago now?
Was it? I can't remember, but
I
yes,
know, and
at least.
And just only scratched the surface on not only your story, but the ways that you have invested in Lifesprings and your impact and some of the things that, along with other leaders, you've been helping build up. And one of those things that we're so excited to talk to you about is this series, Janice, on our prayers of preparation. And those 6 specific things that we're always praying for in all of our meetings. And as I'm doing this, of course, I'm asking, okay, who picked these 6 things? And I heard rumor that it might have been you. The architect, how we got this list of our prayers of preparation.
Oh, those rumors.
Hang on. Before we start this, should we do an introduction as to who Janice is?
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know who Janice is.
Because I'm so random.
No.
Just drop it into the podcast here.
All right. So for those of you who don't know who Janice Gutierrez is, Janice Gutierrez was the executive director for Lifesprings for many, many years. She first dipped into the waters of Lifesprings in 2007, Janice, or was it 2006?
Yes.
So Janice has been a part of Lifesprings for a long time. And then became the executive director and has really shaped who Lifesprings is. So if you're not familiar with her DNA is all over Lifesprings. And so I thought it was really important to talk to Janice about all these things. Not only is her DNA all over Lifesprings, it's also very much a part of my life. I consider Janice one of my life mentors, and she means the world to me, and I appreciate her voice and her wisdom immensely. So I am really glad that we get to interview you for this podcast, Janice. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I am so excited to be with you too. I have loved what you're doing with this podcast, and I'm so excited to be a part of it today and talk about these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're excited too. We've wanted you to come on for a while, but you could have spoken to any of these things. So it was like, yeah, which one do we say for Janice? And having you here at the end of the series feels very appropriate. Again, because you had a big hand in how we came up with this rhythm of praying in our meetings.
So yeah, so I will have to just say I didn't come up with this rhythm. This was something that I was searching for. I was working for a mega church for many years, and it stressed me out. We had lots of meetings, because we have planning this and planning that, this program, that program. And I started to feel like I was back in my old days when I worked in advertising, and my meetings felt very businesslike, very perfunctory, very, we're all doing it. The only difference is, the product was God that we were selling versus what we were selling in the advertising days. And I felt like it became like Christianity was a business. And I noticed that Christian leaders were reading books about how to be good leaders from business perspective. So, the smartest, brightest leaders were going to, guide the church to glory or whatever, and I just, I got weary of that. It didn't feel good in my soul. And I was looking for more of, where is God in these meetings? And so I came across this book that just came out when I was just kind of at the end of my wits in this whole thing. I came across a book by Ruth Haley Barton, who I had formerly been involved with Willow Creek and been a teacher at Willow Creek. And I had kind of tracked her work there as one of the few women teaching and having a voice, that was allowed in that time. And I had gone to several of her workshops and kind of tracked her work, and she was very much bringing people into spiritual discipline practices personally, and then how to expand those corporately. And she kind of put that kind of teaching together in a book called Pursuing God's Will Together. And I grabbed that book and I devoured that book. And I'm like, I want this. I don't want to be at another business meeting. I don't want another clever church program or something that sizzled and looked sparkly and looked good, attracted people because of its sleekness or whatever. I just wanted, to be with a group of people that loved people and loved God and wanted to I don't know, just reflect that love a little bit. I grabbed this book, and the idea was that when the meeting happened, she was talking about church meetings here in this book, Pursuing God's Will Together. Instead of, just coming up with this programming, let's gather to pursue God's will together and see what God wants us to do together. Maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing, but how do we do that? So she explored, how do you as a group pursue God's will together for your organization? And I was just enchanted with some of her ideas. And the book, it's hard to read. When I got it and I told people how much I loved it, and I bought it for a million people, not really a million, but you know what I mean. I bought it for a lot of people. I go, you've got to read this book, because I wanted to do this with somebody. I wanted to be in a group that pursued God's will together. And it's cumbersome to read. It's not easy to read. It's awkward and it's challenging. You really have to go slow through it. And I think the reason why is because it's so revolutionary. I mean, she's giving words to something that's not being done and wasn't being done at the time. And I wanted to do this. And so the great thing about Lifesprings was I found myself in this organization that was like wet clay, that didn't have the meeting thing down, didn't have the was really, it was a group, Lifesprings was a group that really did want to pursue God's will together. And I'm like, let's try this. And it honestly took some convincing, because the idea was that you came together. First of all, how can you pursue God's will together if you're not pursuing it as an individual? So you backtrack and you start with individual practices, and how are you trusting God and experiencing God with your own life? So you bring that to the meeting, so you deal with, what do we need to do as individuals to be part of this group that is pursuing God's will together? And that's where we came up with rule of life and things like that, practices that we can share with each other, that this is what I'm doing to be a person who is pursuing God's will in my, ordinary life. So then we came together as a group. And I think the first meeting, I'm like, let's try this. And I'm kind of like, okay. And so to get ourselves set to do a meeting in a different way, instead of coming to a meeting and say, okay, we're going to have a retreat and we need to, before you plan the retreat, her thing is you don't assume you're going to have a retreat. You start with a question for discernment. You come together and you're trying to pursue God's will together. So you're coming with, what should we do together? And you talk through all your ideas, and then you get to a point where you're going to make a decision. And how do you enter into that decision? 5 people are in favor of retreat, 3 people are not, or whatever. Do you vote? And her whole thing is, no, let's listen to the Spirit. And how do we do that together? So she kind of had this list of prayers that you've been through already on this podcast, like the prayer of indifference. Do you have a preference in the choice of whether you have a retreat or not? I'm just using that example. Like maybe I'm a person who loves retreat, but maybe my teammate hates retreats and has had awkward experiences at retreat. So we talk about that. We talk about what we're walking in with when it comes to discerning this decision. Are we indifferent or are we not indifferent? No, I love retreats. I am not indifferent to the retreats. And then you work to get to a place of indifference, but I'm willing not to do a retreat and do what God says here. And that's what you want from your teammates. So that's the prayer of indifference. And then you pray for wisdom. And then I think some of the other prayers got tagged in with our passion for peacemaking and our passion for stewardship. So I think what we have here is the root of those prayers were in this book. And one of the prayers was the prayers of quiet trust, which is what we're talking about today after 15 minutes of not talking about that. And the prayer of quiet trust, which sounds like, what is that? What is the prayer of quiet trust? What does that mean? So there's 2 words in the prayer. There's quiet and there's trust, and together it's kind of a sense of how we want to position ourselves in these meetings, where I'm just going to make sure. And she uses the verse in this book, how she introduces it. She uses that passage in the Psalm about weaned child resting quietly at their mother's bosom. She uses that verse. I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother, as the prayer, as the way we want to pray, that we would calm and quiet our soul. And the idea being that all the nourishment, all the comfort, all the protection and provision of a little weaned child, comes from the mother, right? Nowhere else. So that's quiet trust. That's putting yourself in this position where you're fully trusting in provision from that one person, right? So then as I've played with that prayer, a passage that has come to my mind is out of Proverbs that says, trust in the Lord, Proverbs 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge God, and God will make straight your path. The idea of trust in the Lord with all your heart. So it's not with all your intelligence or all your years of study and seminary, with all your previous great, brilliant ministry experience, is trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not in your own understanding. What the heck? We're not supposed to lean into our own understanding, but then tie it in with that baby at the mother's breast is not leaning in to its understanding. It's just all it understands is this is the source. This is the source. That's kind of the essence of that prayer is, as we gather as a leadership team to make a decision, a critical decision or about ministry, what's the source of our trust? What are we trusting in? And, I think as Christians, we think we trust God, but when we play around with this concept of what are we quietly trusting in, that's what's unseen about what we're trusting in. Like we just got back from vacation and we took a plane there, and like, I'm trusting that pilot. I'm trusting the mechanics that put that plane together. I'm trusting the air traffic controller people. I'm trusting, a lot of things to fly over a body of water to get to my vacation, right? Alive, right? So I and I don't really think about it because I'm so used to trusting in it, right? But I think also as leaders in ministry, we get used to trusting in a bunch of things that may or may not be God. We trust in our denomination's belief system. We trust in our church traditions. We trust in what our mentors maybe told us. We trust in what we've been reading, and we've been reading these things. We trust in someone else's experience with God maybe, or a leader we think is above us, or we trust in our education. We trust in our economics, our politics. There's a lot of things that we trust in that aren't necessarily God as we go into decisions.
Have you guys seen the memes going around that kind of pokes fun of this? I love them every time. So it's typically a video of a woman praying, like a typical, like what we might look like in our quiet time. And it's like, I trust in God. I trust his plans. I submit everything to him. And then next will just be a picture of Jesus saying, she does not trust my plans. She asks me every 10 minutes. She says my plans are dumb.
And I have not seen that.
Yeah.
I haven't either.
Because I was saying, Janice, that I was really looking forward to this one because out of this list, and I have a little bit of a self-deprecation humor. So as we go through these things, I always kind of poke fun at my abilities to do them, but truly a quiet trust, if I had to guess, might be the one that I struggle with the most. And I know I have to be honest about that because Christa would not believe me if I said I was really good at this. Because every time we have a conversation about like, I think this is how God's leading, or maybe this is what he's up to, and I just need to have trust, she is the one who sees my text messages where I'm like, no, this is dumb. I don't know. I don't know about this one. I don't know. Are we sure? I don't know. This is awful. Or I'm just like, I can't let this go. I can't shake this. I'm still thinking about it, or I'm having trouble submitting to it. So yeah, whenever I see those memes, I'm like, yeah, I could see Jesus every time, like praying things out, or even within ministry saying to people like, I think you just need to trust in God's plan and like have peace in that like if they could see Jesus beside me, he'd be rolling his eyes and be like, Brittany literally just prayed and told me that I can't do this. This plan is dumb. Yes,
I love that so much. And I think that God loves that conversation too and is laughing about it because, you know, the flip on the other person says, the person who's saying, oh, you just have to trust God's plan. Well, where are they getting that plan that's so easy to trust, you know? And I would also say a plan that's easy to trust is maybe not God's plan. Maybe that's why the poor aren't being taken care of. Maybe that's why the widows aren't being taken. Maybe that's why we're rejecting immigrants and not caring for the people in prisons. And maybe that's why we have racism still. I would suggest to you that Jesus's, dining with, tax collectors and sinners and showing the way of life, the way of love, the way of community that honors all people is a really hard plan. And people aren't following it. They want to follow. When people say, oh, just follow God's plan, I think it would be interesting to say, well, what plan is that? Can you explain that to me? Where do you get that plan? Where does that plan come from? And read around the scriptures a bit. There's some pretty weird things that happen in there. And I think that we tend to, we have different ways of knowing things, knowing God's plan, and I like the Proverbs because it says, lean not on your own understanding, because I think of kind of the mind. Like sometimes we give the mind knowing more preference than our gut, just our gut that says, this isn't right. Or our heart that says, this isn't loving, but it's God's plan. Oh, we got to do that, and we override these other ways of knowing God's plans that God has given us, who, our belief is that he's with us, that he's in us. And then we reject that information a lot of times because we're trying to deal with this kind of, I know you can't see me. I keep talking with my hands and illustrating with my hands what I'm talking about here, but
okay, I'm a hand talker.
I'm pointing to my head, my heart, my gut. But, I think quiet trust is listening to all those things. It's listening, like what is my body telling me about this choice? What is my heart telling? What is love saying here? Quiet trust is kind of poking around the fullness of God, the full imagination of God, which we see in creation is incredibly varied. And the narrow way that we've expressed Christianity, to me, says, I think we're trusting in some other things besides God, because God's expression, his creation, his plan is so multifaceted and so beautiful, right? So to really trust and run with it, that's the hard thing to do, Brittany. So all your little texting and struggling, that to me says you're wrestling with what you're trusting in. And I love that for you. I love that you're wrestling with this question. I think this prayer of quiet trust is a really important conversation. What am I trusting in today? What am I trusting in with this decision I'm making about my life? What am I trusting in with this decision I'm making about ministry? What am I trusting in?
Yeah, you said so many things there that I'm like, ooh, I have more questions and I want to expand on. First, I had written this down because I think it just brought up some things in me that I was wrestling with, this idea of, our product was God. And what happens when we're influenced by leadership resources that are not written from a perspective of being a disciple of Jesus? Because we talked about this with our conversation about humility. Now there is a bit of a crossover, I've noticed, between Christian pastors and Christian influencers and those people saying, well, also I lead a mega church, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but like, so from that perspective, like, let me show you how to build something big. And so Janice, when you're saying, well, sometimes following God's plan isn't going to feel the way that probably like a leadership book would tell you success feels like and looks like.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a wrestling in that. But I just wanted to jump back super quickly, because I want to make sure I have the lore correctly here. Because this is the thing. Everybody in Lifesprings is so humble. For a year, and as we're preparing, as we're doing this, I've been asking, like, okay, so like, where did these prayers come from? Like, who started doing this? And no one will say, well, this is how we got here, or this is where these came from. To the best of my investigative journalism, it's come to Janice.
Yes, it has, because I thought pursuing God's will involved forcing my team to read this book and then forcing them to do these meetings. And I say that, facetiously. Everyone was such a good sport. Like, okay, we'll try this, Janice. But it was such a radical way of meeting, where you get together and you want to be, we're busy women. We do not have time to, waste time in meetings. And these prayers were seen as a waste. Gosh, we've been meeting for 45 minutes and we haven't even gotten to the subject. And it was really painful for people who really are busy and they need to get things done. Can you remember that, Christa?
People can't see, putting our hands in the air.
Yeah, putting my hands in the air, because Janice, I was one of those people going, oh my gosh, can we get on with the meeting? Like, it was hard for me. I like, full confession, was super irritated for a long while we were doing these. And it wasn't until I got to a different setting and we started a meeting and someone did a quick prayer and we moved on. And I was like, hang on now. And I realized how much it had actually formed me to boldly enter the meeting once we had actually met together as spiritual beings with the Holy Spirit there, that I realized, oh, this actually is a good idea. It's not as annoying as I thought it was. So that's just, I think I've confessed that on this podcast before, but I'll just do it again. It was a hard adjustment. It was not easy, but I am so glad that you stuck it out for our sake.
Well, I was hungry for it. I'd been in too many really productive meetings that didn't feel holy or loving and didn't seem in sync with the heart, the ways I saw Jesus working in the world, And I think what happens is you get a big, you have to support your staff and you have a machine. Sometimes a Christian organization turns into a machine that has to support itself, right? And you have to have people show up and they have to put money in the offering bin or your staff doesn't get paid. And there's these things behind the scenes of, that keep you on a certain track and don't give you time to stop and say, wait a minute, let's check in with the irony is we're trying to do God's work, but we don't have time to really sit and check in with him about the work, right? So when we started to do this, Christa, you were not alone. So many people go, this is just ridiculous. This is a waste of time, because literally we'd spend an hour and we were just getting to the question for discernment, which was even a challenge in itself. Like, what? We might not do this thing. These things are, there's no sacred cows in Lifesprings. You just gotta, keep asking the question for discernment. And quiet trust, we didn't want to trust. We wanted to trust ourselves that we knew what we were doing. We're trained. A lot of us had been to seminary. A lot of us had been to ministry for years, blah, blah, blah. We're coming with all our gifts and abilities. We know what we're doing. Yeah. And we didn't want to take time to check in with, spirit among us and test for our indifference, test for what wisdom we might need or what we might be lacking, test for what we're trusting besides God. Are we trusting in something besides God here? And not to condemn or to judge, but just to be aware and grow in our ability to find that stance. Ruth Haley Barton says, find the stance where you imagine yourself even snuggled up to God, completely dependent, like a baby, a newborn baby, that needs everything from that. Can you imagine yourself in that position? And can you do ministry from there? That's quiet trust.
So some of these questions you're saying, some of these prayers came directly from this book that you're referencing?
Yes.
And then also just because of who we are and other things that we value, there were other ones that got added to this list of 6.
Yes.
So that was that's probably why people are like, I can't point exactly to who wrote it. Yeah. So that's really cool. But specific to the prayer for quiet trust, how we practice it is based that much more on Ruth Haley Barton's work.
Yes.
And that is very, very interesting to me because I've also referenced this on this podcast before, that I did read this book twice. And now I'm going to read it a third time. So the first time I read it was because someone in a ministry team I was part of said, this is what we're reading this year so that we can team better. Mandatory reading, mandatory compliance to love each other better. So read the book, kind of took what I could away from it. I remember at the time thinking it was great and thinking I wanted what she was describing, but I didn't think that we had it. Read it again as it was one of the readings for a seminary course I did. And so at that point, I had already been part of Lifesprings and thought, wow, I'm reading this through fresh eyes because I've experienced it a little bit. And saying to Christa, like, I've read this book before, and it's like I'm reading a totally different book, like understanding how much my attitude and what I was experiencing within a team, how that impacted it. And so when I say I'm going to read a third time, what I'm realizing is, having read it twice, I still didn't remember that quiet trust was in there. As you are saying, the baby analogy, I am remembering it. And yet now, having lived these prayers out and seen how it impacts the ministry, like, I need to read it again. And I think I need to read it again where I say to myself from the first page, I believe that what is written here is true. Do you know what I mean? Because as Christa said, when I started, I thought this was painful. It hurt me because I never have enough time.
Yes.
Janice is like, we know. We started the podcast 15 minutes late. I'm always running behind. I just have a million things on the go. And so efficiency is have had to let go of many, many times. But then recently I'm going into a meeting, or I'm actually seeing some of my coworkers go into a meeting. We've got some hard conversations and things we have to figure out because that's the nature of serving vulnerable people. And before she heads in, I can see how she's carrying her shoulders. I can see the tension in her. And I say to her, remember, find the peace within yourself before you try to bring peace to the meeting. And she turned and looked at me like, what are you even talking about? Like, what are you? He's like, sometimes you just say these things and it's like, okay. And I mean, she doesn't know, but that's a Lifesprings thing. And that's a teaching, from Audrey, that what we talked about is to be a peace bringer isn't just what we figure out, but finding peace within myself. And so, that's just me saying, I have noticed, you're right. Experiencing something else, going into the Lifesprings rhythm of always making time to pray for these things and valuing them felt hard. Like, oh, this is different. Then going back into another space where we don't do it at all feels harder.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, whoa, I could tell just by looking that we're all, carrying a lot of tension, and not necessarily for each other, but we're coming out of meetings. We're like, ooh, that was really tough. Yeah. And I'm like, we just don't have these tools for what it looks like to posture ourselves before God before we even come into resolution.
Right. And I think, Brittany, yes, I think we've been wrestling with this from the beginning of the time. And the desert fathers and mothers, they go, we can't do it here in Rome. It is too uptight here. We got to get out of here. And we got to, and so everyone's always been wrestling with how do we find this balance between living in the world with our limits of time, energy, resources, and how do we, live a contemplative life where we are in continual communion with God, enjoying her, all the fullness of God that is available to us, because the kingdom of God is now here with us, and not missing that. And so I think respectfully, you're trying to make use of your time. You're trying to be a good steward. I think the Pharisees didn't start out trying to be these horrible people who killed people, to get, keep the purity of their culture or whatever. They wanted to honor God, and they wanted to follow God, and they wanted to, they were trying to find a system that worked, right? Mm-hmm. And so we are trying to find a system where we're using our gifts, we're using our talents, and balancing the thing about a quiet trust. Jesus always is upside down. Everything's upside down, the last shall be first, and all this kind of funny stuff about the kingdom of God. Is the irony is, I think it's more efficient. If you are a person who really wants to do God's will, it is more efficient to spend an hour praying like this and having your team come together around pursuing God's will than to be, clip and doing things maybe that don't need to be done anymore. Maybe you just might save so much more money by pursuing God's will together, by entering into a meeting with questions for discernment with God than not. That's the irony of it. I think you save time. One thing that happened to me is I was so passionate to learn more about this balance and finding this balance that I did go to the Transforming Center and entered a 3-year program under, Ruth's mentorship, and did this Transforming Center thing with, I don't know, what were we, about 100 other leaders. And the irony was, we had questions for discernment we were supposed to hold. And one of them was my questions for discernment about my vocation. I just thought I'd be the executive director of Lifesprings till I died. I mean, what better job in the world? I got to, meet with incredible people and experience incredible things with them, right? And pursue God's will. I just wanted to do that forever. And in the process of discerning and holding that question with indifference and with quiet trust, I felt the urge to move out of that role and to pass that role on to the next generation, and to do it well and respectfully. And, and that was just such an honor. That was one of the great joys of my life. And it was one of the surprises of my life. And I wouldn't have done that. I think I would have held on to that role forever had I not taken the time to really discern that question. So the irony was, I found myself, I was training in leadership and found myself out of that leadership role. The thing I missed the most, my first year outside of being involved in the Lifesprings leadership team, was those meetings. Because what happened, I was meeting, 2 or 3 times a week with different teams with Lifesprings. All of the meetings were about pursuing God's will together over these different, areas of service. And I was just experiencing the love of God in every single one of those meetings, the wisdom of God. We were praying and we just had this, I didn't realize how I did know how rich it was. But then when I stepped back and I'm like, I have no meetings. What's my relationship with God like now? When I don't have a team to pursue God's will, so I had to kind of retool what is it that I do to, have quiet trust in God, to discern the questions of my life, as an individual. That the team provided a place where that all happened. So I missed that about Lifesprings.
That helps us with one of the questions that we've been asking with all of these prayers, because we intentionally pray for it in community, is to understand the difference between what does it mean for me to be a faithful steward or a peace bringer on my own, versus what does this mean to practice this as a community. And when we talk about these 6 things, we always say in some of the intros that these are things that we believe a community can do. And Christa brought up last time when we were debriefing about our podcast episode on humility, we're like, we didn't actually talk about what this looks like to practice as a community. So maybe we'll have to do a part 2 of that.
Oh, interesting.
Can you tell me a little bit about Okay, this is a two-parter. How do we practice and live out quiet trust as a discipline in community? And already in the context of this conversation, we've kind of talked about quiet trust around the idea of you have to make a decision, which makes sense because in a community, if you're meeting together and you got to figure something out, that's really important. I'm now in my head, I'm thinking about, okay, what's the distinction here between what we said it looks like to practice the prayer of indifference versus quiet trust? Mm-hmm. And my assumption, and I think you illustrated it very well, is indifference does probably have that much more to do with like the decision and saying, not my will, but God's, and that there's peace in that. But that quiet trust maybe isn't as much about what do I do or not do, but understanding what it is that sustains you, regardless of where you are, right? Like that's part of that analogy of the nursing mother and the baby is just understanding that God is who sustains me, not the outcome of this decision or not, or this relationship. Yeah. So would that be, so that was part one is, would that be a good way to distinguish a prayer of indifference between a prayer of quiet trust? And then if so, how do we do that in community?
Okay. So they are distinct and they're subtly distinct. I think the prayer of indifference, okay, for example, if you're, of a denomination or the Christian faith is very wide. There are many flavors to Christianity. And as you travel the world, you see there are a gazillion different denominations. There are a gazillion statements of faith, right? And so in prayer of indifference is, I've picked this denomination. This is my statement of faith. And so when I'm on an international leadership team and we're making, I'm walking in here and I'm thinking, this is the statement of faith I grew up with. This is the statement of faith of my denomination. I am not indifferent to this being the way. Out of all the gazillions of ones, mine is right? And so when we come up with our team philosophy, or when we're hiring a speaker who goes against maybe my statement of faith, but is in the Christian spectrum or even not, and the question for discernment is like, who's our speaker or something, I'm not indifferent. I don't want these other like a Baptist doesn't want a Catholic doesn't want a, that kind of thing goes on, right? They're not indifferent. Does that make sense? And so when you come together as a team, it's kind of laying that out. Like, I'm not indifferent here, but I'm going to try to get to indifference and see what the best speaker for all of the people that come to this event, who has something that we need right now to come and teach to us, right? So it's kind of working through your prejudices or your prejudices and preferences. That's the indifferent part. And every team member comes in with a set of things. That one was an obvious one, but quiet trust is more, I wake up this morning, I begin with God. I just want to be in relationship with God. And I don't know how my day is going to go. I don't know if people are going to like me or not like me. I don't know if I'm going to get what I need and want and desire today, or if the day's going to be just like a mess, right? This is kind of the Julie of Norwich. All shall be well. All shall be well. And I'm going to not panic. I'm going to try not to panic. I'm going to try to stay tucked in under the yoke, the gentle, easy yoke of God. And I'm going to try to go into that meeting, even though I'm hurting, or even though I'm angry about something, or even though someone looked at me cross-eyed and made me angry and wonder, whatever, you walk into a meeting, and there's all those dynamics of body language and stuff. I'm just going to ignore that and hang out here with God who loves me. And I want to work from this position of beloved and with beloved, and all shall be well. So that's kind of, I'm going to just trust that, however this meeting goes or however this ministry goes, I'm going to show up with love. I'm going to show up and I know the source of love, and I'm going to let that love flow through me. And I'm going to stay connected like a child, nursing from her mother would stay connected to that source of nutrition and love, right? So it's a posture. And Ruth suggests we picture ourselves in that posture. And imagine being at a meeting. We've all been at these intense meetings and everyone shows up and they've got their notes and they read this and they have their opinion, And imagine if we all just took a minute and we just tucked into whatever that looks like for us, right? That posture of quiet trust. And then we kept checking on that. And maybe we kept returning to that. Maybe we need to return to that posture 3 or 4 times during the meeting. It is unconventional. It is unconventional. I'm not saying throw out all the great leadership books that would never do this in a million years. I'm just saying it's worth it to keep putting yourself in a position of quiet trust with God. Like, okay, this is where my comfort, this is where my shelter, this is where my protection comes, not from the result of this meeting, not because someone listens or doesn't listen to me or likes or doesn't like my opinion or votes the way I want them to vote or doesn't vote the way I want them to vote.
It seems like this answers the question of how do I truly become indifferent, which is a question we asked, not just on our episode of Indifference, but peace. We talked a lot about that, where I said, okay. And I had said, is the prayer indifference, is that, to Audrey, is that what allows me to be a peace bringer and find that peace? And she had said, yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And now it seems like, okay, but how do we get to, quiet trust? Because I am thinking about the times where I truly do think I was able to get to indifference in a meeting and feel like the release of the weight. As I think there was a moment where I stopped and just had to remind myself, this might not go the way I want. This might not end up being the decision that I would have chose, but it's going to be okay regardless, because at the end of the day, what's true about me is I'm loved by God and that all things will be reconciled. And that, maybe if it's in conflict, regardless of what this person thinks about me, it doesn't mean that that's true about me. But who I am, what sustains me, and where my hope is actually not not what we're arguing about here. So that's how I get to indifference. We've talked about kind of that metaphor of the nursing mother, which for me feels really special. It helps me easily relate because I have had 3 children. For someone who doesn't connect to that analogy, I'm always trying to think about other people who are listening and not.
Absolutely.
As we said in the very beginning, understanding that as women are one of the reasons why we think this space is important is because when books are written by men who don't have the same perspective, it's hard to see ourselves in that. So now I'm just thinking about some other things. For me, being beside like a freshwater stream, glacier fed, never to end, feels also like that idea of this has been here forever. It will continue to be here. That's
right. Well, no, I've got you on this one because Ruth Haley does mention this in here because, we've all been babies. We all entered as babies and we were all fed somehow. But some of us have had extremely traumatic entries into the world and we were not fed by a loving mother, or that is a traumatic imagery. And she addresses that. And she goes, if that doesn't work for you, find that image that does, right? So for me, I'm somewhere in the middle on that one. I know that I wasn't a breastfed baby. I know that anyway, we don't need to go into our history of how we ate or didn't eat as babies, but also if we've had that experience as a mother or not a mother. But the idea is, what is that nurturing source and how do we connect into God as nurture? And I love going to the image of Mary with Jesus. I love every image I see of Mary with Jesus all the way into the Pieta, which is an image that's really helped me a lot as, my children have gotten older and things happen in the world that seem crushing or whatever, just holding on to her beloved Jesus, right? And so, and then the image of the lightness of the yoke, come all you who are weary and living, come here. This is a place where you'll be restored. Come to me, all you who are weary and living, and I will restore you. I'll carry this burden for you. So going somewhere where someone's going to take the burden and you can just go along for the ride. So Ruth addresses that. And I think that's really important, Brittany, especially as leaders in ministry, is not to put an analogy out there that, is fraught. But also, I think we don't want to shy away from the power of that imagery of complete dependence, a newborn completely dependent, because that's what the psalmist is talking about. This is quiet. This is a quiet trust, is that you're going to be cared for, even though you're completely incapable of caring for yourself. That's hard because life knocks us around and we don't think that, right? But to get back to that trust in God that way it takes a lifetime of practice, I think. A lifetime of, okay, I'm going to trust you here, God.
It feels very vulnerable, just this part of the conversation, because there is so much of life where I feel if I don't take care of myself, this isn't going to get done. And just to say, I am being taken care of, whether or not this specific thing gets done, does not feel normal.
Yeah, and the reality, Christa, and you know it because your heart is with the Palestinians. It feels like sometimes no one's getting taken care of in some places. Yeah. It doesn't feel like anyone's getting taken care of at our borders right now. It's like, where are you? There are times in history and spots on this planet where I'm arguing big time with what does that quiet trust look like? What would it look like for them? And I think it's really important to go there, not just go, oh, we can trust God, because their lived experiences, they can't.
Yeah.
And so what do we do with that? And how would we find quiet trust in that situation? How would we even begin to talk about this? I think you can't leave that out of this conversation, It's easy to believe God when things are going great, The crucible, the desert, out in the desert, that's a different kind of faith. That's a different kind of story, and that's a different conversation with God.
I did ask because I think representation is important. And I love that you said, that Ruth acknowledges that, and that we understand as leaders how some of these pictures, like even as we often talk about God as Father, to acknowledge that for people who have a very painful relationship with their father, that they might need to look for a different picture. But the other reason I brought it up is because I think the way that we picture it, I mean, quite literally, like close our eyes and think about it, is very important. It is a specific tool that I've used. And to me, there's a really big connection between what we're doing here and what we're saying we're doing within Lifesprings with this, and the idea of it as a discipline, and what modern psychology is saying. So I'll share something personal and be brave. For some trauma that I have experienced in my childhood, I tried EMDR, which it didn't work for me. I've been told that it works a little bit better for like if your trauma is in like a car crash, like one thing that happened, one specific event versus something more complex. So I'm not for or against EMDR, but so I'll just say my experience was, the idea is both with the rapid eye movement or like this little tapping under your shoe, that you would be able to think back to the memory and then kind of condition yourself to instead to go into freeze or have this physiological reaction to the sense of danger that's coming up just from being in the memory, that you would teach yourself to go to basically a happy place. And I'm sure if a psychologist is listening, they're saying you're doing a terrible job but this is, at least I can say for me as a patient, how I understood it when it was being explained to me. And so when I had tried it, the doctor said to me, okay, go to the memory. And then he would say, okay, now I want you to, like, in your mind's eye, like open a box. And in the box is going to be something that brings you peace or safety. Or, maybe you picture yourself on a beach somewhere and you can hear the waves. And so you're using that part of your brain that, because it can see the thing that happened that's caused trauma, to instead see this thing that brings you peace. And so eventually, while we were doing this for the millionth time, I had said to him, it's not a beach and it's not a box. The problem is it's Jesus. And I would say he was an atheist because he was kind of like, okay, I mean, if that's what works for you, sure, whatever that looks like. And so what ended up being helpful to me is picturing what I imagine it would look like to have been the woman who grabbed Jesus's, like, just the bottom of his robe, bleeding woman. Because I can't picture Jesus in my brain. That's just too glorious of an image. I can't picture what he looks like, but I could picture a cloth. So grabbing that. And what is helpful, I would say, in this process about EMDR is the connection between what happened, and instead of being stuck there, for me, what ended up happening is when I would go back into these memories and I was picturing Jesus, suddenly I was picturing him there with me. And so the memory was not, this thing happened to you and somehow, you survived. The memory became, this thing happened and Jesus was standing beside me the entire time. And I'm holding on to his feet, or I'm holding on to his robe. And so I say that in that when we're going through something and I'm like, I just need to trust, that can be very hard. And you can picture yourself as a baby, you can picture yourself beside a never-ending stream. But what I have found helpful is to think back to the times where I really needed to trust and to know that I was sustained by Jesus in that moment. Like, I'm here because he continued to sustain me. And so that becomes a continuation of how I'm trusting right now.
Yeah.
It's like, and he's still standing. Does that make sense?
I love that. I love the concept of what are you grasping for? Because I think that is trust. You're going to grasp for the thing that's going to save your life. You're going to grasp for the thing that did save your life. You're going to grasp for that woman had tried a lot of things for many, many years. And then she caught a glimpse of Jesus and was like, if I can just touch a part of him, I think, I'm going to try, she was going for it. And so I think in going back to the prayer of quiet trust, it's like, what are we holding on to? What are we grasping as we meet together as leaders trying to pursue God's will together? And, I think a lot of people believe, they think, I believe this. Belief is not the same thing as trust. Believing God is good is not the same thing as trusting God is good for you. Christa, you alluded to this, that, okay, I believe God is good, but I am going to take care of myself here because my history is that nobody else, like I've needed to in these situations. Right. Or, Brittany, I'm going to, I can't do this. I can't do this because my history is that I couldn't depend on that. That wasn't trustworthy imagery for me. That's not a trustworthy place for me to go. So I think, the thing about the prayer quiet trust in a leadership team is you start to just have this moment in your meetings where you say, let's pause and take some time for a personal prayer or corporate prayer, quiet trust, is just to sort of to kind of get into the practice of what am I trusting in today? And I think that shifts with our experiences. It shifts with the way our faith grows and moves and we experience things. But, I know that for me, I used to trust. I know there was a season where I went, we're all readers. We all talk about what we read, but there was a season where, I went into my bookshelves and I took out every single book that I knew was written by a complementarian. So, you know what? I'm just not going to, they're great, they're nice, but I'm just not going to, I don't want to trust somebody that subjugates women anymore for my reading knowledge. I'm just taking all those books out. I'm not trusting them anymore. And there was years where I would it doesn't matter what they think about women in ministry. Well, it does. It does, because it mattered to Jesus and it matters to, half the population, right? So there was a moment where my trust in who I read shifted, those and what denominations, your trust shifts because you've put your trust in these things. But the idea is to be working on the trust in how do I trust God? And what I'm hearing from you, Brittany, is you've been wrestling with how do I trust God? How do I trust Christa? How do I trust ultimately in the universe who's going to care for me? Who is going to? How am I going to trust that God is going to be there for me when no one else is? These are the deep questions of our faith, and this is really rich. And to spend time in your leadership meetings with these questions, this will bless your ministries. This will bless your lives. And I think it will flow into everyone you work with, because as we help people identify their misplaced trusts, as we identify our own misplaced trust, we're free. It frees us. It frees us from systems and actions and things that keep us confined in ways that don't grow our relationship with God.
I feel myself like it's not even reacting. Don't take negative. When you say, Brittany, I hear you struggling with trust, my thought is, do I struggle with trust? Is that what I said? I'm like, it kind of sounds like it. If I'm saying every time I'm being like, okay, God, but I'm still texting my friend Christa saying, I don't trust this. I don't like this. I don't feel good about this. I'm like, that is what I'm saying. But what I'm realizing is, I think I've said this before, is like what I always say, and I think it does come down to just lack of trust, and I'm just trying to package it differently, as I always say, I would trust God with whatever he told me. If he said, I want you to move here and do this, and it doesn't matter, I would be like, you got it, boss. But I don't feel like God's telling me what to do. So I'm sitting there, these conversations where I'm talking to Christa, I'm so frustrated, is because I'm finding myself in a situation and I want to move forward in a way that God would want me to. And I'm asking the question and I'm praying for indifference, or at least I think I'm like, okay, I'm indifferent. And I'm asking godly people and I'm trying to steward my resources. I'm doing all these things in hopes that God will say, great, red or blue, blue. That's what we're doing. And then I always say, and if you say that, then I'll do it and I'll trust you. But I can't get past the idea that God won't just tell me what the answer is, so I can just go do it. And that's what I mean. I'm like, I'm realizing as I'm thinking through it, I'm like, because you don't trust him. You don't trust that if he doesn't give you an answer right now and relieve that building pressure of having to wait, that it's because he's not hearing you or he's not, working it out. So I guess that stinks to know that that's true about myself. But
I think it doesn't stink. I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful because, we're supposed to be growing. We don't want to not grow. And this to me sounds like growing. I don't think it's wrong to find yourself in a position of not trusting God. That's just an area to grow. Like, well, why not? There's a lot of reasons not to trust God. Honestly, they're endless. And I wrote about this extensively, that I reached a point where I felt like, okay, I just don't trust, God's ever going to answer my prayers. It seems like I asked for this, I get that. I asked for this, like was a season where I didn't trust. I didn't know even how to pray. And that drove me to practice of centering prayer, where I'm not going to ask you anything and you don't have to give me anything. I'm just going to be here with you. But what I think the exciting thing here, when you identify this, what the exciting thing about quiet trust, it's really a place to grow. I don't think we arrive at a difference. I think indifference is a fluctuating thing. And I think we have our personalities, and there's things we're just, sometimes we have to remove ourselves from meetings because we're like, hey guys, you guys decide this on your own, because I'm completely not indifferent. I don't want to do something at 5 a.m. in the morning, like I'm not indifferent, but like I'm being, that's a silly example, but there are times where you're just not going to be indifferent to something. And there's times that there's going to be places that are very hard to trust God in. It is not easy. And that's the journey of our faith. And I think sometimes we've made it not safe to wrestle with those things. And then so people get stuck because, I'm not going to say I don't trust God because I'm supposed to trust God. I'm not going to say, and then we can't work it out. And we need places. And I love Lifesprings for this. And I love talking to you guys about this because Christa and I, go further back than you and I, Brittany, but I know you guys are birds of a feather. But Chris and I have hours talking about things that to push through some of these questions about what we can trust and what we've trusted in, and where is God in these hard situations. And, can we rest? And can we even say, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manners of things? That's a huge statement of faith. And for her to get there, Jolene Norch to get there and be able to say that statement, I think she worked really, really hard at that. I've not worked, but I think she had a lot of these kinds of conversations to get to the place that, okay, ultimately in the end, the universe continues and I am just like a vapor and all shall be well.
Yeah, it probably is your expectations. Like if coming to a posture of quiet trust, the expectation is that you will resolve and get whatever decision or answer that you need. It's probably not going to give you the result you want. But if you're coming to quiet trust to say, regardless of whether God tells me what I'm doing or I figured this out, I am being sustained by him. That's a different posture. So when we talk about doing this in community, I've offered myself up as an example of someone who says, I know I should trust God. I'm going to just trust God, and then proceeds to complain to my community about how I'm not feeling very trusting. So Christa, and it sounds like you've been this person for Janice too, and vice versa. How do we do this for each other? So you have this person and maybe they're going through it, or maybe they're just exhausted, and we're praying for quiet trust with one another. We're praying together, or you're the one who's receiving messages where someone's like, I'm not able to trust. I'm not able to rest in this. How do we help each other? Invite each other into it, and not for the purpose of legalism. I'll say that this isn't about checking boxes and saying you Christianed right today, but because we sincerely want our brothers and sisters to release that heavy burden that they're carrying, and we want them to experience what it feels like to just rest in God.
Yeah.
I so love the idea of creating space for others. And when I am not the one in crisis, but someone else is, to take the position of peace and rest that I'm in and to invite others into that space. And so I can't change that person's situation. I can't change how you perceive what's happening in your life right now. But especially when we are not in crisis at the same time, I can invite you into my calm. This is such a big part of parenting. As a parent, am I escalating the situation when my kid is going off the rails, or can I be the calm that they are so desperately seeking? So this, is convicting for me, because I do not feel like I am always super good at this in the day-to-day of my life right now. But when I have the ability to trust in the calm in my own life and then to invite others into that space, can they more realistically trust in that calm simply by being there?
I love that. I think it's a huge ministry just to provide people calm and space to work out the questions of their heart and their faith. And I love these practices that you guys are doing this podcast on, because I think it keeps an organization from being hypocrites. Mm-hmm. Because when you talk about quiet trust, what you're talking about here, I mean, you are great women of faith, and you're talking about, I do believe, help my unbelief. Mm-hmm. And you're just, there's a purity to addressing these issues of what we're trusting in and where we're at and what we're hoping for and what we're disappointed in. And then going to being with each other in the freedom of honestly saying where you're at, and no condemnation going on in that conversation, but just working it out. That keeps an organization from being hypocrites. I think it keeps you, that is a practice of humility, to admit, to be honest about, I trust God here, but I don't really trust him here. And I trust God here, but I'm going to lock my doors, and whatever you need to do to ensure you're cared for or whatever. This is a very real and important conversation. So on my vacation last week, we were on the beach, which I love so very much. And if you ever doubt the amazing, creativity of God, you just put your snorkel on and you go in the tropical waters and you see all the fish and coral, and your mind is blown again with God's creativity. But anyway, I was sitting on the beach and I was watching this dad with his little, like maybe 3-year-old, and you could tell the man wasn't really comfortable around water. And so his son was not going to be comfortable around water. So the little boy is running. You could see the dad panic, grab the kid. Here's a beach it's pretty mild and kids are playing all over the place. Not this kid. This kid, the guy sat by the water, held the kid so tight with one arm. And the little kid had his other arms free to kind of play in the sand, but didn't sit in the sand, didn't get his toes in the water, didn't get, you could tell the dad's fear was keeping that kid from feeling the water on his feet, maybe falling over into the sand, but not able to be a kid on the beach and a normal kid on the beach with all these other little kids. And I just wanted to go down there and go, I'll hold your son's hand. I'm comfortable in the water. I just wanted to give that kid a little walk along the shore free, right? And I think I'm getting to my point here. I think sometimes in Christian organizations, we want to hold everyone so tight because we are fearful of them getting swept away in something. Mm-hmm. And so they don't get to explore the questions of their faith because we're scared. What if they get washed away, or what if they do something wrong, or what if so we hold, we make rigid rules that's what the Pharisees did to keep everybody in line and everyone straight. And you got it. And if you do these things, you trust God. If you do these things, you believe this thing, and we have all these structures like that man holding his child. And so the kid's at the ocean, but he's not really getting to experience the ocean. I think with these questions of quiet trust that come up, the questions that pop up with quiet trust and indifference, I just think there's so many riches there. There's so much to explore, and it just widens our faith and widens our experience with God. It's the difference between a kid that's confined and doesn't get to have the experience of the kid running up and down the shore, laughing and delighting in our faith. And I think we get to laugh and delight in our faith when we get to be free and ask the questions and be where we're at in our faith without judgment. And Christa, you're providing that space for people. It's really just that. Lifesprings provides that space. Brittany, this podcast provides space for people to think things through. And hopefully everyone's thinking about getting to explore these things a little bit more. It's fun.
I love that analogy. What I love about it is I can imagine if we were talking to the dad, he might say something like, well, I'm scared my son's going to get swept up by the wave and drown. Mm-hmm. And of course we would not say like, no one's ever drowned in the ocean. That doesn't happen. It can happen. Mm-hmm. It absolutely can happen. So it's not like no, what you're afraid of happening isn't real. It's like, that has happened before and that is scary. But let me tell you about what is also true. Like, I'm going to be right there. Or this is a safer beach as far as, I actually have no idea how tides work and stuff, but I can understand that there are some parts that there's a rip tide or anyways.
Yeah. His fear was real, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And so
I'm thinking about one of the other ways that I know Christa has responded in these times where either I'm kind of spiraling or maybe we've been in a meeting with other members of our team. She's very good at identifying what's true and what's not true. Like, could that happen? Could this person respond that way? Yeah, that would be hard. Or it did happen and that was hard. But I can remember one time saying, well, I'm just worried that in all this, like maybe this is happening to me because I think I said like God is angry at me. I think God might actually I don't think I'm God's favorite. I remember Christa being like, okay, I don't think that's true. What's making you think that about yourself? And the reminder that we know who God is. We know the character of God. And I'm thinking now that what you were doing is being like, you are beloved. Like, this is what's true. This is what I can tell you is that like God loves you, that is always a source of sustaining in that nutrition picture. So I can't tell you that the bad things you're worried about aren't going to happen, but I can tell you that God isn't, punishing you or any of these things. So maybe that's the other piece as a community is to listen to people, be a safe space, and to kind of say, I can point you back to who God is and where your hope comes from, even if I can't tell you that you should trust that this is all going to work out the way you want, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people drown.
And that is the prayer of quiet trust right there. That is it. That's the essence of it. It's providing that time in your meeting. Saying we're a people who's trying to pursue God's will together. And we're all, trying to trust that God is who we think he is. God is, I'm trying not to refer to God as he anymore, but it's hard. It's so ingrained in me because, God is so much more than the personification of what we've made, but
it's a good point, especially in this, to think about the ways in scripture that God is given, for lack of a better word, feminine pronouns and described as a mother or nurturing, because when you have that picture that we're talking about of it talks about the bird with tucking her chicks underneath the wing, that is a picture of God too. And when you have that reference, I think it is easier for you to envision that and to go to the scriptures and find peace in that picture.
And Jesus even referring himself to as a door, as light, as, living water, which defies either of those things. So I love those imageries too. Oh, so good. Such good stuff.
This was a really rich conversation. I mean, I knew talking to Janice about quiet trust was going to be great, because we had even said we don't want someone that is necessarily really quiet to quiet trust, because then it just seems like, well, you naturally are a quiet person, so you do quiet trust. We're like, but someone that is not known to be super quiet, is the right person to ask, what does this look like in real life? For those of us that aren't necessarily quiet, how can we do that when that's not our natural tendency? And you exude life. You've got lots of words that I have greatly benefited from. And so I thank you for bringing those two together in such a beautiful and natural way.
Are you calling me a noisy, quiet truster, Christa?
I am, in the best sense
Amen.
of the words.
I am a noisy, quiet truster, and I love talking about it. So yeah, it's a conundrum.
You're also someone that I think of as very wise. And once again, you don't have to be a quiet person to just be a wise person. God made us all in all shapes and sizes to pursue these virtues.
Yeah.
And I see them in you. And so thank you so much for sharing them with us today.
It's so fun to be here.
In a speed round.
Yes.
Janice.
Yes.
What are you reading? Who's influencing you?
This is no speed round, Brittany. So, I've always got about 10 books going. So let me tell you about them. First, I'm reading this book called Between the Listening and the Telling by Mark Iaconelli. Reading this, my husband and I are reading this together with some friends. It's kind of like Leslie Leland Fields, who's a very familiar person with Lifesprings about Your Story Matters. And this is a book that takes that to another level. And he actually has created storytelling communities that really are saving lives. And so we're reading that book. He is the son of a youth pastor who was very renowned, and he gives an inside scoop of being in that home. And I think that was that's one of those disconnects that people in leadership have sometimes. And you get an inside look into the home of a pastor's kid and how story saved him. So that I highly recommend. I also am always reading a book on centering prayer. So my latest one is The Heart of Centering Prayer by Cynthia Bourgeault. This book is kind of blowing my mind. It is there's parts I just don't understand. She's way above my level intellectually, but she is just taking me back to some theologians about this subject. She's kind of going through the history of centering prayer and bringing forth some theologians I hadn't even heard of before. And it's really rooting me in my centering prayer practice. I'm also reading a gazillion books on pilgrimage because I'm actually writing a book on pilgrimage that I'm just finishing up this year. And I am also going on a pilgrimage to Iona this summer. So I've been reading all sorts of pilgrimage stories and all sorts of Iona stories. And the latest one I'm reading, which is required reading for my pilgrimage, is called The Way Home, Discovering the Hero's Journey to Wholeness at Midlife by Ben Catt. And I think I'm past midlife, but it's really good. And I'm also trying to read the words of, I'm always picking a woman mystic. And right now I'm read along with Hildegard of Bingen. So I'm reading just a book about her, of her writings. And this is my hard one that I'm reading. Do you want me to go on? But with another group that I'm involved with, we're reading the diaries of Eddie Hilsum. She's an adult Anne Frank. She is a woman who was in her 20s, who lived in Amsterdam, who journaled almost every day. And she ended up dying in a death camp. But she journaled almost up to the day she died. And these are her journals. And I'm reading it with a group. We're trying to figure out how to live in America right now, where we see a lot of our freedoms taken away. And it's kind of watching her see that happen in her. It's her writing about what's going on in her life, kind of like Anne Frank did, but before she, she never got tucked away like that. But it's very sobering. And the conversation we're having around this book is very sobering. So that's my pile right now. I do not have enough hours in the day. And amazing. Let's start a book club.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because we actually are. So for those who are listening, we are about to go through a book called Throw Another Pebble on the Pile by Michelle Felice, who we recently interviewed in one of our episodes. And we're going to start in July. Mm-hmm. It's a short book, but we're going to take the summer, like to the end of August. And then we're pretty sure, Michelle doesn't know this yet, but we're pretty sure we're Zoom her in for our last kind of meeting. We'll do it in a private Facebook group so people can ask her questions. So we are going to have a Lifesprings Canada book club.
Ooh,
we're very excited about that
yippee.
because Janice,
so
we are with you in our love of books. I also want to tell people right now that it's so funny. So we talked about this in humility, how Christa and I don't do a great job of spreading the word about the podcast.
Yes.
For Michelle actually just recently wrote us and was like, you two need to get the word out because this is valuable.
She's love that you're humble, but also get the word out. So we have done a little bit better job of creating that space as far as social media for people to connect with us. So if you're listening to this and you're like, how do I engage with Lifesprings Canada? And then by extension with Lifesprings International, we're on Facebook and we're on Instagram. Go follow us. Check it out. Very excited.
I will.
Yeah. Well, Janice, I'm excited to talk to you more about some of those things that you just mentioned. My daughter's name is Iona, and I named her after that. And I've always wanted to do that pilgrimage. And I love that I know other women in my life who say things like, currently the female mystic that I'm reading is, that I know other people who say that. So thank you so much for this time.
It's been so fun. Yeah. Good luck. This podcast is awesome. You're the best kept secret in podcast world. Keep it up. Keep it up. Stay encouraged.
We appreciate you so much.
Love you guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for the time.
Bye.